Right as I reached the end of the hallway, the impossible happened. The phone rang. I stopped dead in my tracks and thought, okay, that's impossible. I just took the phone off the hook. The only way for that to happen would be for the phone to be placed back on the cradle. My thoughts continued. He's in that back bedroom, and he must have reached out of the door that I was just standing next to and put the phone back on the base after I walked away. I was too scared to turn around, and so in my dazed, adrenaline-pumping state, I walked into the kitchen as the phone continued to ring. I grabbed the biggest butcher's knife we had and walked back and stood at the base of the hallway, facing all of the closed doors, knowing he was behind one of them. I saw at the top of the hallway that the phone had indeed been hung up, which confirmed it was in my home, and I was going to take him out. Hello, and welcome to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and this is the second half of my video on the self-help books of disgraced former therapist Jodi Hildebrandt. In my first video about Jodi, I broke down Jodi's self-help philosophy. We went through the book Rings of Responsibility, which may or may not have been written for children. We learned how to differentiate truth from distortion, sort of, and discovered that idioms are the work of the devil. Today I'm going to delve into her other two books, but the focus will be on Jodi personally. First, we'll briefly visit Arming the Next Generation with Weapons of Truth to learn about Jodi's ideas regarding lust, and then we'll really dig into her more famous self-help book, You Are Not Not Enough. I'm going to skip most of the philosophy of the book because it's exactly the same as what I discussed in my last video, and because it makes me feel like I'm living in an alternate universe if I read too much of it. This time I want to focus on the personal stories Jodi tells, many of which are baffling. Also, I am again sorry for the glacial pace at which I've been releasing videos lately. The day after my last video came out, I got the flu, and my asthma still hasn't calmed down, which you can probably hear in my voice. I'm going to let my mic hang in the picture today so that I'm sure it records well enough that I can jack the volume up later. I was hoping to have finished my series on Visions of Glory by now, but obviously that hasn't happened, and I have a couple of Lori Daybell related videos slated for April, but I will absolutely keep working on Vogue in the background. Anyway, let's begin with a simple question. What's wrong with Jodi? That's what everyone wants to know, right? Every time I ask myself that question, I think of this moment in Con Air.
What's wrong with him?
My first thought would be a lot.
That's the simple answer. What's wrong with Jodi? A lot. Her nibbling Jessi has stated that their understanding is that Jodi's been diagnosed with both psychopathy and borderline personality disorder. A psychologist named Natasha Helfer said that she couldn't even speculate about what was going on with Jodi, that she anticipated that a full psychological evaluation would result in 5 or 6 diagnoses. What everyone seems to agree on is that Jodi has severe psychological and emotional problems. I've heard that the reason she's always in long sleeves is that her arms are covered in scars that she gave herself. One thing I've noticed over and over is that her thinking is, well, I don't want to say distorted, but that's what I mean. The woman isn't thinking clearly. Before we get into the story of her life, let's look at an example of how disjointed and manipulative her thinking is. In 2020, Jodi wrote a book called Arming the Next Generation with Weapons of Truth. The cover of this book is kind of hilarious, in my opinion. I think Jodi didn't want to be pictured with an actual weapon in case that made people think the book was somehow about violence, but her standing there in a cheap windbreaker with a helmet photoshopped over her hand looks ridiculous. As with Rings of Responsibility, I have no idea for whom this was written. The title implies it's for young people, for the next generation. There's no mention of them anywhere in the text. The content seems aimed at adult readers, but the 2 testimonials on the back cover both specify that they came from parents, so who knows? The book is intended to be part of a 5-week course. Each of the 5 chapters ends with a list of recommended Connections podcast episodes the reader can check out. Also, there are pages and partial pages and a space at the bottom of every page, with nothing but blank lines on them. as if you're supposed to take notes or do exercises, but there aren't any prompts. She did manage to get the page numbers in order in this one, although they appear in the gutter by the binding, which I've never seen before. Every single one of Jodi's books has some wild formatting thing I've never previously encountered. I really think she's trying to kill me. One of Jodi's many, many overlapping and contradicting processes for living in truth involves identifying and then arguing with our distorted thoughts. Truth declarations. Truth declarations are bold, succinct statements of truth designed to eradicate distorted thoughts. How to create a truth declaration, TD. 1. Recognize the distorted thought. 2. Say your name and tell yourself, Jodi, stop. That's not the truth. 3. Say a one-sentence statement that is the exact opposite message of the distorted thought. Begin your statement with, and the truth is. 4. Design a truth declaration that overwhelms the distorted thought. The truth declaration must contain facts. Facts are objective and can be known by others. Emotional honesty and personal responsibility. This is called truth. State it as powerfully as you feel it. You must reframe each statement of distortion by beginning each statement with, and the truth is. Continue to say, and the truth is, followed by as many statements of factual truth as it takes until you recognize, feel the distorted thought lose its hold on you, and leave. This practice of evaluating our thoughts for truthfulness and accuracy is at the foundation of cognitive behavioral therapy. Jodi didn't invent this. You take a step back and question whether you're minimizing or catastrophizing, and then you can correct yourself with a more realistic thought. It's actually really effective and a super useful tool to have in your back pocket. But Jodi's explanation of how to find a sensible counterthought is badly presented, and this example she includes is almost incomprehensible. I think that there is an error in the first line of this example. It says, 1, I don't have to do this, distorted thought, SA. She never explains what SA stands for, so I have no idea in this context. But I think she meant to write, I have to do this instead of I don't have to do this, based on how the rest of the example goes, so just keep that in mind. 1. I don't have to do this. Distorted thought, SA. 2. Jeannie, stop. That's not the truth. 3. The truth is, I don't have to do this. I'm not being forced to do anything. One sentence opposite statement. 4. The truth is, I made a commitment. And the truth is, it's my responsibility to keep my commitments. And the truth is, I always have choice, and I don't have to do anything that I don't choose to do. And the truth is, I don't feel confident with the commitment I made. And the truth is, I can change my mind about this. And the truth is, I was not fully aware of what I was committing to. And the truth is, I didn't ask questions to find out what I was committing to. And the truth is, I'm going to change my mind and let them know that I won't be attending. And the truth is, I don't need to take their reactions personal because I changed my mind. I feel like I'm having a seizure every time I read this. Let's assume there's an error in the text and the initial distorted thought is supposed to be, I have to do this. Even with that correction, I can't sort out Jodi's thought process here. There's no logical progression in these so-called truth declarations. What it really demonstrates is how Jodi justifies doing what she wants. This character, Jeannie, in this example, made a commitment she doesn't want to keep. Never mind that Jodi hammered home the importance of keeping commitments over and over and over in Rings of Responsibility. Jeannie doesn't want to go do whatever she committed to do. But she can't just admit that, because according to Jodi, you're supposed to be perfectly selfless and never want anything. So instead of just saying, no, I don't want to go, we get this series of justifications for why the entire situation is unfair. Jeannie didn't understand what she was committing to. She doesn't feel confident about the commitment she made. whatever that means. She's allowed to change her mind. It isn't her fault if people are upset that she's bailing on them. I'm fascinated by this example because it demonstrates so much about Jodi's thinking. First, it demonstrates that her process of countering distortion with truth makes zero sense. Second, it shows us what Jodi actually does. She uses blame-shifting statements to justify doing what she wants without admitting her real goals. That's textbook manipulation, and we're going to see it over and over in these stories, so keep that in mind. But also, it's so disorganized. It's unrelatable. Whatever is wrong with Jodi Hildebrandt, a lot of it originates in this distorted thought process. We're going to revisit arming the next generation with weapons of truth, but I want to start our walk through You Are Not Not Enough. This book came out in 2019, and it's dedicated to Pam, Dana, and Stacy. I assume that Pam is Pam Bodger, the president of Connections. After Ruby's youngest 2 children escaped from Jodi's house, the police found Ruby's middle 2 children with Pam, who appeared to be using them as free domestic labor.
So as long as she's not tied up and bound because
I did make her scrub.
do something, you know?
I did make her scrub the floor, and they vacuumed and stuff because I have company coming tonight from Costa Rica.
Although I've never heard anything about what they've gone through, my guess is that they were also being mistreated. Jodi has a history of using children as free labor. Her nibbling, Jessi, who's awesome, and I'm going to refer to them a lot because I find them very credible, was horribly mistreated by Jodi. And one of the things Jodi forced them to do was all of the billing for her therapy practice. So we've got Ruby using her children for content, and Jodi using her children as office help, and Pam using the children as maids. And it all seems tied into Jodi's belief that children are tiny adults. The introduction to You Are Not Not Enough begins like this. The greatest lie that has ever been told is this: you are not enough. Many of us have not only heard this lie, we have bowed to it, worshipped it, believed it, and repeated it in thousands of ways. Its deceptive voice has many shades and tones. The introduction discusses how everyone is a child of God, and nothing you can do, no choice you can make, will ever change that. I think that most people who believe in God would agree with that statement. The problem is, knowing you're a child of God won't magically fix all your problems in life. Jodi wants to hand-wave all the practical conflicts we experience by saying that once you know you belong to God, everything else will fall into place. That's a lie. She's opening the book with a lie, which is pretty ironic given that she claims to be identifying the greatest lie ever told in the very first sentence. Also, I have to mention the thing she did with the formatting of this book in an attempt to get me committed. She includes footnotes, or maybe endnotes, numbers in the text, but they don't refer to anything. There are no footnotes, just numbers that send the reader on a wild goose chase through the book looking for references. I don't know if it's an editing error or an actual mind game. Chapter 1, My Story. After 4 pages of introductory psychobabble, Chapter 1 opens with Jodi explaining how often she's been asked how she learned all this amazing wisdom. She says she's been through a terrible journey and offers to share her story. She begins with her backstory. Her father was in the military, and her mother was a homemaker. My parents had very traditional roles for the time period, and neither of my parents were available to be vulnerable about their personal experiences and pain that life inevitably presented to them. The motto in our home growing up was, "You're a Hildebrandt. Go hard or go home." I really don't know how you can go hard or go home if you're already in your home, but I guess we just didn't go hard enough in my home. Almost immediately, things begin appearing in the narrative that make me want to say, wait, something's not adding up here. As a child, I quickly learned how to be a pleaser, a doer, a hard worker, and obedient to a fault. I was always considerate and willing to help, needing little interaction to keep me satisfied. I also learned how to manipulate the attention I received. I bought my parents' attention with the currency of my obedience. Even before we get these red flags around manipulation, Jodi tells us that she needed little interaction with others as a child. I'm not a child psychologist, but don't most children need attention? Friends? Parenting? Jodi was the 6th of 7 children, so she should have had playmates, but she's going to tell us that she spent most of her time alone, even as a small child. That concerns me. That seems insignificant, however, compared to the last 2 sentences of the excerpt. I also learned how to manipulate the attention I received. I bought my parents' attention with the currency of my obedience. You can't manipulate attention, so I assume what she meant was that she manipulated her parents for attention. Regardless, the way she's characterizing this is so messed up. All kids want attention from their parents. That's not manipulation, that's survival instinct. Maybe in an ideal world, parents would be able to lavish time and attention on their kids, but if Jodi learned to get her parents' attention by being uber obedient, that's certainly better than learning to get it by hitting people or setting fires, right? But Jodi believes that no one should ever want anything from anyone else, especially not attention, because knowing you're a child of God means you don't need attention. I did not know that my misguided obedience was inviting me into a world of no emotion, which then disconnected me from my vulnerability, my real-life experiences, and physical and emotional safety. It was no one's fault, really. Rather, the environmental and emotional outcomes of my own choices and the choices of those around me introduced me into a world of dishonesty. What we're hearing here is that Jodi is disconnected from her emotions. She may not feel a lot of emotions very intensely. If she is actually a psychopath, that would make sense. Most psychopaths have a diminished capacity to feel. But she could also just be someone who learned as a child that her feelings didn't matter, or that they were bothersome to her family, so she began ignoring them, and then that became the way she got through the day. That makes sense in light of the bizarre example from Arming the Next Generation. Maybe the character Jodi wrote can't admit she doesn't want to go to this event because she can't identify her emotions. She describes how one of her siblings died unexpectedly at 4 months of age due to a heart defect, and how her mother shut down emotionally afterward. Though many people around her were interested in her grief and pain, she was not willing to disclose the devastation she felt. That tragedy, along with many other painful experiences in my mother's life, resulted in her choosing a controlled and controlling exterior, which appeared to serve her well. I believe Jessi referred to this woman as a force of nature in their interview.
My grandmother was a force to reckon with. She, not, I would say, in my experience as a granddaughter, not maternal in any way, shape, or form. Hard woman. 5'10", 5'11", tiny powerhouse of a woman. Terrifying.
So we know that Jodi's mother modeled suppressing her emotions. It's interesting, too, that Jodi implies that if her mother had shared her grief with others, that might have lessened it. One thing we saw in Rings of Responsibility that we're going to see throughout this book is Jodi's belief that privacy of any sort is unacceptable. Except for her. She repeatedly argued in Connections videos that children had no right to privacy. Here's a clip from Dr. G's channel.
For many people who have raised responsible, honest, humble children, it's really clear that no, there is no privacy. Privacy is not a principle, put it that way, for a child.
Now, something you're going to see over the course of this video is Jodi becomes more and more hostile. Her voice gets more and more intense. There's something about the idea of privacy that really does not sit well with her.
Now, there are many children that don't have adults in their life that are modeling those principles of truth for them. And so privacy for them seems like it's a right.
In fact, a lot of children want their privacy, not all, a lot, as a hiding place.
The truth is wanting privacy may not mean you're hiding. However, the motive behind the privacy. So if my child comes to me and says, I'd like to keep this private, and I say, there is no privacy in this house, sweetheart. and they say, well, I get to, I deserve it. That reaction means that they're hiding something.
So this is legitimizing people maintaining absolute control over others. So it's saying if somebody has a reaction that you're going through their stuff or that you're violating their privacy in some way, that means they're trying to hide something. This is a manipulative tactic.
If they say, okay, here you go, then no, they're not hiding anything.
So the mere fact of not giving privacy exposes secrets.
Yes.
Really a strange idea.
Again, it's not a matter of I want to shut the door when I go to the bathroom. It's your reaction when you aren't able to shut the door. When someone says, you can't have that.
Jodi's going to extend this belief from lack of practical privacy to lack of emotional privacy later in this book. Her father was similarly repressed, although in his case, it sounds like he was also paranoid. He had a fearful perspective of people and their motives. He shared those suspicions with me often, saying things like, no one else will really love you except your family. People cannot be trusted. And we are the only ones here for you. Don't tell your kids that. Those are not good messages to impart to a child. Between the two presentations of my parents, I immaturely concluded that my security, worth, and value depended on me being nice. Don't create waves, trust only family, be pleasing, work hard and then work harder, be fearful, don't fail, don't upset mother, be helpful, don't complain even if you're hurt, be tough, excel in all you do, protect and defend the family name no matter what. These aren't healthy messages. Even a perfectly healthy child dropped into this family would grow up with serious issues. Assuming Jodi is the biological child of these two, it seems very likely that she was born with a genetic or neurological predisposition toward mental illness or a personality disorder, perhaps with an underdeveloped amygdala. It makes perfect sense that being raised by a woman who couldn't acknowledge her emotions, but could get very upset, and a man who spewed paranoia would have worsened Jodi's issues. I'm not making excuses for Jodi. I'm just saying, if we want to understand how these types of people are created, she's telling us right here. Genetic predisposition to mental illness, paranoid father, emotionally withdrawn mother, failure to teach a child how to manage their emotions. That all combines to set her up to have problems. Most of my childhood days I spent alone, playing by myself and roaming my desert playground. I could usually be found interacting with the goats in their pen, milking them and riding them. I liked being alone and felt safe with my animals. I did not have much adult supervision, as my father worked full-time and my mother appeared overwhelmed with many tasks and duties. Jodi presents this as somewhat idyllic, but what she's saying is her parents were absent, both emotionally and physically, and that she had to turn to barnyard animals for emotional support. She sort of glosses over this lack of supervision, but in the next paragraph, she describes how a 15-year-old neighbor boy mistreated her in the worst possible way from the ages of 2 to 5. Where were her parents? She was a toddler wandering around the deserts outside Tucson, who was routinely disappearing long enough for a neighbor to SA her, and no one noticed? That's horrible. These experiences encased me in confusion, isolation, and fear, so much so that I conveniently forgot about them until I was in my early 20s. Because of my misplaced obedience and desire to be good, I was silent and never told a soul. As a child, I never spoke about this mistreatment and all the accompanying lies and manipulations. I simply concluded that I needed to be better, the best, always helpful and kind. I felt a drive to be strictly agreeable and never disappoint or complain. Something terrible happened to Jodi over and over across a 3-year period. And because she had no emotional safety with her parents, she couldn't tell them. The fact that she felt like she needed to behave better and be a better person shows us that she blamed herself. We now have a likely biological predisposition exacerbated by bad parenting and then compounded by mistreatment. I don't know how Jodi could have come out of this situation without major mental health problems. The more I study Jodi, the more I feel like this issue with privacy is significant. And it makes me wonder if part of her believes that if her parents had given her less privacy as a child, they would have known what she was going through. Is that where this belief that children shouldn't have privacy originated? I don't know, but it seems possible. Unfortunately, the emotional temperature in our home was numb, so no one noticed anything abnormal, though my little world had been introduced to abhorrent, vile, lustful evil. I read this passage because of the word lust. It appeared, inappropriately, in a couple of illustrations in Rings of Responsibility, but it got its own chapter in Arming the Next Generation. Here are Jodi's thoughts on lust in Arming. Definition of lust. Lust is the reflection of selfishness. It's about satiating me by taking from others. Lust is a complete focus on the self. It is a craving for the wants and desires of me to be fulfilled, no matter the cost to another human being. The only thing that is of importance to me is that I obtain what I want, how I want it, and when I want it. The other person is used, exploited, demoralized, mistreated, and ravaged to fulfill and justify my own self-centered appetites for immediate self-gratification. Lust is driven by selfishness, objectification, fear, distortion, impulsivity, deception, and gluttony. When I am lusting, I will use people, things, money, food, experience, memories, fantasies, anything as a means to get what I want to fill the emptiness, fear, and insecurity I feel within myself. When you are insecure within yourself, you will experience distortion, which creates lust. Lust is ravenous, insatiable, voracious, predacious, and rapacious. When I lust, I experience no connection to others nor to self. I feel only possessiveness, entitlement, and ownership of others and whatever else I deem to be mine. Then below that, she includes the footnote. 1. Lust means any form of self-gratification. Lust is another word for distortion. I would have put that right at the beginning, but I guess I should just be glad that she remembered to actually include the footnote. So, it will surprise no one that this isn't a definition of lust. If I had to choose a single concept it describes, I would say it most closely resembles selfishness. What stood out to me about this chapter wasn't that Jodi's definition is inaccurate, I was used to that, but that this is the most passionate writing in any of her books. Even in her other passages about things she classifies as evil, none of her prose is this florid or intense, and I can only assume that means that the word lust is especially triggering. I mean, she's personally pricked by the word lust. Why? Again, I'm assuming, but lust carries a far more sexual connotation than selfishness. Listen to how vitriolic this next section is. Lust is not love, and the belief that lust is love is a soul-destroying distortion of reality. Lust actuates moral decay of a human being, promotes objectification and betrayal of a person both physically and spiritually, and abjectly denounces and deprecates their soul. To complicate this further, lust masquerades convincingly as love. It presents itself as the very face of selflessness and connection, keeping its selfish intentions hidden until it has entrapped its victims. By assaulting, subverting, and animalizing the most innocent of our desires, lust makes its way into our own souls without our notice. It is the very definition of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Is she talking about lust here? Is she even talking about selfishness? Most of her writing uses words for evil interchangeably, but this chapter is an outlier. She seems to be discussing something specific here, some specific experience, and I think it was the mistreatment she experienced as a child at the hand of this neighbor boy. lust masquerades convincingly as love? That sounds like a description of, what you do when you wash a dog and blow dry it and braid its hair. That word. Someone presents themselves as having good intentions until they've drawn their victim in, using the victim's innocence and naivete against them. I think that Jodi unconsciously associates lust with the mistreatment she suffered as a child. While it's completely understandable that Jodi has issues resulting from this trauma, she's intellectualized them instead of healing them. This is from Arming the Next Generation. You must accept in your mind and heart that lust is connected with everything that is evil, vile, destructive, violent, lascivious, ravenous, salacious, insatiable, and the demise of one's soul. Those are not the words of a woman who's faced her trauma. Instead, she's rejected all notions of healthy sexuality. The idea that you can have a fulfilling, happy life appears nowhere in these books. So let's talk about Jodi and S for a minute. And this is where I'm going to get really speculative. I've mentioned before that for a queer person, I have lousy gaydar. In spite of that, I feel strongly that Jodi is a lesbian. She's got a quality. I don't know what it is. Her vibe, the khaki shorts, it's something. Her nibbling Jessi, who's also queer, feels the same way. And they told this story during an interview with John Dehlin.
I've thought that since I was a kid.
That what?
That potentially she was queer.
Okay.
And I am queer. So I'm for it. I think it's great. It's real great. Waters are warm. And I have no idea. She did say something to me when I was living with her that was very strange because I've known I was queer since I was like 7. And it was like experimenting with girls and friends since I was 7 or 8. And that was, she knew about that and it was very bad. It was very evil. But then she said something to me. She had this friend, her name's Bev. She said something to the effect of, yes, being gay is evil and, pleasures of the flesh and yada, yada. But if I were to have sexual relationships with my friends, if we were to it would be different because there's a deep emotional connection there. And that's different. And we were sitting in someone's living room and she said this and I was just like, what? Yeah, that's called being gay. What do you think gay relationships are like? They are emotional and deep and connective and yeah. So she did that. That is something that she said to me. I mean, other people were there. I don't know. I don't remember who was there. But that's the closest thing I've ever had where she admitted out loud to anything.
Okay.
There's such interesting psychological distancing here. Jodi's suggesting that if she were with a woman, somehow that wouldn't be gay, because she was raised in a culture that rejects being anything other than a hetero cis person. So she has to justify herself by saying it would be different if it were her. The LDS Church is very much anti-LGBTQ, although I gather that an increasing number of Mormons have caught on that we aren't really a threat to anyone. Still, being gay wasn't an option for Jodi. She grew up in a culture where she was expected to marry a man while she was quite young and delight in having his babies, which probably wasn't what she wanted. And in any awareness of her own desires was likely another thing she had to push down and repress, another thing that made her feel bad about herself, another desire she had to destroy. Additionally, in Sherry Frankie's memoir, she confirmed that her mother, Ruby, and Jodi were in an sexual and romantic relationship. At one point, Sherry caught them giving each other candlelight massages, and they were sleeping in the same bed after Ruby kicked her husband to the curb. So, on top of the genetics and the awful parenting and the mistreatment by the neighbor boy, throw in the shame and self-hatred of being a lesbian in an anti-LGBTQ friendly community. And I want to be clear, being queer doesn't make you more likely to mistreat other people. But being forced to pretend you're someone you aren't, being denied the right to just exist, having to live a lie, absolutely can. If you're straight, imagine what it would be like to grow up in an exclusively gay society, where you were expected to marry a person of the same gender and go to bed with them every night. You aren't attracted to them. You don't want to touch them, and you don't want them to touch you, but you can't tell them that. You just have to submit. You have to pretend to enjoy yourself. And you have to do it for years. Because if you don't keep pretending, you're going to lose everything and everyone you love. How could that not fill a person with rage? That's a recipe for the kind of mental health problems and unhappiness that can easily turn into cruelty toward others. Lesbian or not, Jodi has issues around S. In Arming the Next Generation, she provides 46 examples of misconceptions, assumptions, and beliefs about sexuality and connection. And some of them are perfectly obvious, some are inaccurate, and some just have nothing to do with the subject. The first one, number 1 on the list, reads, "Sexual orientation is set at or before birth, and it is unchangeable. The best way to be accepting and loving to these people is to accept their behavior. The truth is, there is no scientific proof that people are genetically predisposed homosexual, bisexual, transgendered, non-binary, queer, etc." This is the only item on this list that she feels the need to back up with an unofficial truth declaration. She's lying, by the way. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. But isn't it interesting that she couldn't just let this one stand on its own? That she had to correct it and to emphasize what she feels is the right view. She didn't do that with any of the other 45 items on the list. It's clear that this issue in particular has got her personally pricked. Now, keep in mind, these are all supposed to be incorrect statements. 3, I have sexual needs. Does that mean the truth is no one has any sexual needs? 10, self-love is natural, healthy, necessary to relieve sexual tension. 11, since teenagers are having S anyway, we ought to teach them safe S practices, such as using condoms. Heaven forbid. 14, I can control my lusting. So does that mean the truth is that we're all just out of control with our lust all the time? Like, what is she trying to say here? 18, women aren't as rational as men. Okay, I don't know what that has to do with S. 22, large breasts are naturally attractive. She's right. Large breasts are hideous. They just, I throw up every time I see a pair. 30, lesbianism is not homosexuality. I don't know who's been telling her that. 32, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Jodi hates that slogan. She mentioned it in Rings of Responsibility too. And it speaks to this obsession with not having any privacy. The idea that secrets are inherently evil. 33, I don't affect anyone. My life is my life. Again, what does this have to do with S? 39, what I choose to do in my own bedroom home is nobody else's business. It doesn't affect anyone else. 43, people who are chromosomally male can lactate, gestate, or menstruate. It's unsurprising to me that Jodi, with her black and white thinking, has ignored all of the science around sex and gender and can only see male and female. I found it really interesting how many of these have nothing to do with sexuality. Instead, Jodi's stressing the idea that what you do matters even if it doesn't affect anyone else. She's insisting on a sort of moral and psychological rigor. You must be perfect, even in private, even in secret, even when it doesn't matter. It all comes back to this emotional self-exposure she insists upon. It's very culty. Getting back to Jodi's life story, things only get worse. Sadly, though I was perfect in living my unbendable motto, I was assaulted again. this time by a boy from a placement program whom my parents invited into our home to live with us. He was 16 years old, and I was 7 when the mistreatment began, and it ended when I was 9 years old. All my fears, beliefs, and conclusions that I had reached about my worthlessness were confirmed. Again, emphasizing there was no way back to worth or enoughness for me. I was bad. I'm gonna come down real hard on Jodi in a few pages, but I'm feeling a lot of compassion for little kid Jodi. She just couldn't catch a break. This is horrible. No child deserves this. Although it isn't mentioned in the book, Jessi says that Jodi also made accusations of a similar nature against her siblings, and I just wonder what was going on in this family. How does a child of 9 years of age move forward with those filthy images in her mind? How can she, naive to the evils around her, reconcile those events? Easy. She forgets. And that's what I did. That was my brilliant way of living out the remainder of my childhood years. She's very flippant here, but that doesn't change the fact that she's talking about a child who was so traumatized and so completely unsupported by the adults who should have been caring for her that she had to cut her mind into segments to function. She had to create a partition in order to survive because she couldn't save the part of her that was being hurt. Repression is a sort of psychological amputation, albeit a temporary or incomplete one. This child was suffering intensely. Jodi doesn't say much about the next decade. We don't hear anything about her teen years other than that she tried to be perfect to counter her internal sense of shame and badness. I'm sure we could learn a lot from what she was doing during this time, but she doesn't share. I've learned a few things, though. She apparently had a beautiful singing voice. I couldn't find evidence of that, though.
First I was afraid, I was petrified.
Yes, that's Kevin Frankie, as one of her backup dancers. She was an excellent basketball player, and she competed in beauty pageants. Yeah, something else she and Lori Daybell have in common. The narrative picks up when Jodi's 21. She was preparing to go on her LDS mission, but the church told her that she couldn't go because of her history of migraine headaches. She saw a doctor who told her the migraines were psychological in origin and sent her to a psychiatrist. Now, I don't completely buy this story. Migraines are incredibly common, and although they're excruciatingly painful, they aren't actually dangerous. No one has ever died of a migraine. And they have a lot of causes besides emotional issues. I have a laundry list of triggers I have to stay away from. Everything from flashing lights to strong odors to dried fruit. I just wonder if this story is true or if it's a half-truth meant to explain why Jodi got told she couldn't go on a mission and sent to a therapist instead. With a feeling of terror that logic couldn't explain, I went into his office prepared to give him the right answers so I could have clearance for my mission. Little did I expect that he would see right through my obstinance and fear and zero in on my denial and protective posture. 3 hours later, I came out with the burden of memories so heavy upon my shoulders that no words could describe its weight, one of shock, fear, confusion, hopelessness, worthlessness, and panic that, at least in my conscious mind, I'd never experienced before. Never before in my life did I wish for death's door to benevolently open wide and swallow me up. I recall feeling intensity of pain and vividness of thoughts about my childhood that I'd shut out before. While I had spent the first 2.5 hours attempting to manipulate, control, and distract this kind man, he was perceptive and did not allow me to duck and dodge his questions. The last 30 minutes, my invisible shield cracked, and I was left with horrid memories, smells, images, and sounds of interactions with one of my perpetrators. I couldn't escape the truth any longer. I remember looking across the room, shaking with emotions I had no words for, as tears fell from this compassionate man's eyes. I was struggling to even breathe. I sat in silence as intermittent tears came to my eyes, yet never fell. What was this? What did this mean? Was this real? What happened here? This is crazy. She went to see a therapist for the first time for a 3-hour session and came out with recovered memories of years of mistreatment? Either those memories weren't as repressed as she says they were, or this therapist did something very unethical. And that leads to a question I can't answer. One that's so far-fetched I almost hesitate to voice it, because I think there's probably a 2% chance that I'm right about this. But my question is, was this therapist Tom Harrison? The answer is probably no. I have no evidence that the answer is yes. However, we know that Tom Harrison and Jodi are friends. She appeared on his podcast and spoke at one of his conferences. I've never heard either of them discuss how they met. We also know that, at least in the recent past, Tom Harrison was the person who decided whether or not young Mormons were psychologically sound enough to go on missions. How long has he been in that position? Does he evaluate all the Mormon missionaries, or just the ones around Salt Lake, or just the ones who have red flags? And we know he's obsessed with CSA. He certainly strikes me as the sort of unethical practitioner who would push a client to dredge up years of repressed memories during their first session together. Like I said, that's total speculation. But I wonder, because it would explain a lot. This experience was a catalyst for my journey to find answers to heal my own wounds, and once I became a therapist, to heal the wounds of others. During my journey to healing, I was not the traditional patient. I was curious and somewhat suspicious of the professionals I worked with. I resisted their attempts to diagnose my behavior, knowing intuitively that these labels were not components to my healing. As I participated in their interventions, I was inadvertently enabled to stay sick. Because of my trauma, I was allowed to not be responsible for my thoughts and feelings, and I was permitted, and at times even encouraged, to blame and hold resentments, which I could feel dug a deeper, steeper, inescapable prison for my soul. This is the point where my compassion gets overwhelmed by my anger. Jodi had an awful childhood. I suspect it was far worse than this book makes it out to be. She probably has stories that would make my jaw hit the floor. But she also had every opportunity to heal. She was diagnosed while she was still young. She had the chance to receive treatment. She had the privilege of getting an education in psychology. The house where she held Ruby's kids hostage has been on the market for $5 million. It's not like she couldn't afford therapy. She could have afforded to get therapy all day, every day. She had so many advantages that other people don't have. And the fact that she rejected the help and rejected the healing that was offered to her means that she's 100% responsible for everything she did later on. She had every opportunity to avoid becoming the monster she became. Why didn't she embrace the help she was offered? Well, let's think about what she says here. I was permitted, and at times even encouraged, to blame and hold resentments. If you're a therapist and someone walks into your office and says they endured years of CSA, who are you going to tell them is at fault for that? The client or the person who hurt them? Obviously the latter, which leads to the question, why would a client resist assigning blame to the person who hurt them? When it comes to something as huge and life-altering as what Jodi endured, I suspect the resistance to assign blame is really resistance to identifying with being a victim, because that's painful. Admitting that something bad happened to us is inherently painful, and a lot of people avoid that pain by insisting they were partially responsible, that they weren't a helpless, unsupervised toddler alone in the desert. We saw her do this on the first page of this chapter. It was no one's fault, really. Rather, the environmental and emotional outcomes of my own choices and the choices of those around me introduced me into a world of dishonesty. Her own choices were partially responsible for what she suffered, according to her. Now, we can all look at this from the outside and say, that's ridiculous. But from the point of view of someone who's scared of feeling helpless and vulnerable, this kind of makes sense. It's also something I associate with narcissism, especially vulnerable narcissism. If you can't admit you're anything other than perfect, you're going to reject the notion that you were a victim too. And Jodi hates victims, as she made perfectly clear in Rings of Responsibility. The idea that you need to come to terms with having been a victim in order to heal from trauma is one that she completely rejects. Another thing that Tom Harrison and Jodi have in common is that neither of them actually seem to believe psychotherapy works. It's weird because they both practice it, but in ways that undermine it. Like here, Jodi basically says that all the psychologist's treatments failed. Never mind that she refused to accept her diagnoses. No, she says she had to turn to God to save her from this literal hell, all caps, she was in. The same way Tom Harrison claims that psychiatry has failed and we all need to bring God back into therapy. Again, I think it's really interesting how similar their ideas are on this matter. Tom Harrison has said repeatedly that only Jesus can heal children who've been mistreated in this way. People like Jodi double down when they're called out. I asked Gosha why he thought she got a master's in educational psychology when she clearly doesn't believe in psychology. And he said, "How many evolutionary biologists do you think don't believe in evolution?" I said, "Hopefully none." And he shook his head. He said that every math professor has a story about that one student who comes in with a big stack of papers and claims that Pythagoras had it all wrong and he's going to revolutionize the field. Jodi does seem to have believed she was going to revolutionize the field of psychology by dramatically disrupting it. She's the Elon Musk of the self-help world. And I think the reason she took the position in this early experience was because she was diagnosed. If she has narcissistic traits, and this armchair psychologist certainly thinks she does, she might have taken her diagnoses personally, especially if one of those diagnoses really was antisocial personality disorder. I wonder if she felt rejected by the field of psychology and decided, well, I'll show them. I'll become a psychologist and I'll be better at it than they are and I'll prove there's nothing wrong with me. That seems like something Jodi might do. After her rejecting her diagnoses and the idea that the person who hurt her was responsible for hurting her, Jodi quit therapy and started praying. I don't believe that's what actually happened, but that's what she wants us to believe. For 20 years, I've been asking heaven for answers on behalf of myself and all those I work with. I've spent tens of thousands of hours asking, studying, listening, and praying to see clearly how to apply principles of truth to human suffering and pain. As I have called upon heaven on behalf of myself and others, instructions have come to me like a slow drip, one true healing principle at a time. This reminded me of Melanie Gibbs' claim that she spent 4 hours a day in her prayer closet, and I wonder if there's a competitive air around how much time people spend praying in the LDS community. All my Exmos, let me know in the comments if this is a thing. As with Jodi's teen years, there seems to be a lot left out here. That's as much straight autobiography as we're going to get, though. The rest of the book is all psychobabble and just random personal stories presented in no order. What happened between Jodi's early 20s and her early 50s, I don't know, but she didn't get better. Her mental health got so bad in the year before she was arrested that she couldn't take care of herself and had to move in with friends, and after a couple of months they couldn't deal with her any longer and kicked her out, and that's how she ended up moving in with Ruby Franke. According to Sherry Franke, Jodi stopped bathing, she was living off Dairy Queen, and she was convinced she was being attacked by Satan on a daily basis. You've seen the Hulu documentary, then you've seen footage of Jodi pretending to be possessed. She looks like she's doing a bad Exorcist impression. She ends the chapter by giving a huge list of situations and circumstances that the principles she's learned can fix. It's a list that's so long and broad that it includes everyone on the planet. Thus ends Chapter 1. Chapter 2. What is connection? Jodi opens this chapter by answering one of my central questions from Rings of Responsibility, which was simply, connection to what? I'm glad she finally got around to answering. Apparently the answer is God. Connection is the spiritual and emotional confidence that all is well, that all is centered within you. Glad we got that cleared up. She then immediately confuses this issue by writing 3 long paragraphs about how connected she felt to her childhood best friend's family, which is an entirely different form of connection. When I was in their home, I could feel the connection that I was so hungry for, and I loved it. Though I did not have the words to describe what was happening at the time, I remember feeling seen, cared for, and loved, all of which are components of connection that were missing in my childhood home. Yeah, Jodi came from an unhealthy family. This section is actually pretty sad. She talks about how her best friend's mom would ask if the girls wanted anything to eat, but Jodi was too scared to ask for anything, and how jealous she felt when she saw her friend snuggling with her dad. The invitation to connect was extended to me as well, but I was not available to accept it because it confused and scared me, and I did not have the emotional skills to engage with it. It's obvious that the incredible coldness with which her own family treated her affected how she later treated children. Her parents taught her that lack of compassion. Her parents taught her that children are just small adults. But I'm not letting her off the hook, because she's telling us she had other role models, and she's saying that she learned how to connect later. Where's the evidence of that? Is Jodi just lying to herself that she changed? Her own children reportedly don't speak to her. She's in prison for hurting someone else's children. She can say she learned how to connect, but I'm not seeing evidence of it, at least not when it comes to her interactions with kids. Then Jodi tells a story about a friendship she developed later in life, although she doesn't clarify when. I remember meeting someone and really liking her. She and I appeared to be cut from the same cloth. I felt understood and seen, and so did she, and we quickly became friends. I remember feeling scared to share this new relationship with my other friends. I did not want anyone to feel jealous of the time and attention I was spending with her, so I kept her hidden from the rest of my life. I would do things with her on certain days and times that would not conflict with my other relationships, because I truly believed that my friends would be angry at me for replacing them or not loving them as much. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I think Jodi was romantically attracted to, if not involved with, this person. This story doesn't make any sense otherwise. Why would her friends be angry that she made another friend? Generally in life, we expect to have more than one friend, and our friends expect us to have more than one friend. We're not monogamous in our friendships. One day, one of her old friends asked where she had been on a particular day, and Jodi confessed that she had been with her new friend. I took a deep breath and told her, I was with a friend of mine, and we were hanging out. She said, who? Because she knew all of my friends. I was choking on saying her name, because I did not want to face what was to come. I said her name quickly, and then began to explain my choices. I told my friend that I had met her a few weeks back, and that we'd been doing some things together. I remember closing my eyes, waiting for her reaction, knowing her hurt and anger was coming right at me. Does this level of anxiety sound proportionate to the situation as Jodi has described it? Or does this sound like the kind of anxiety that accompanies coming out? If you read this as 3 straight women navigating their friendships, it feels overblown. But if you read it as a woman coming out to her best friend, it makes perfect sense. And maybe I'm biased here because when I came out it felt a lot like this, but that's the interpretation that rings true for me. Jodi's friend, by the way, was very happy for her. What? I thought. No anger, no yelling, no shaming, no tears, no accusations? I immediately began crying on the phone as I confessed the last few weeks of concealing my whereabouts. The gratitude that she expressed for me having another friend in my life and her compassion were amazing to me. I don't know which of us were more shocked at the other person's reaction. We both cried and shared how much the 2 of us meant to each other. She very thoughtfully modeled connection to me as she iterated over and over that she loved me, and that love didn't diminish if I shared my time with someone else. Again, this level of emotional intensity feels way too high for the situation as Jodi has described it. But you know what nice people do when their friends come out to them? They reassure them that they love them just the same. There's often crying. This whole story is so surreal to me because it's almost a stereotypical depiction of how coming out goes when it goes well. There's usually hugging and crying and reassurance. And I'm glad Jodi had people who supported her, but twisting the details to remove the gay element makes the story inexplicably dramatic. Jodi then goes into explaining honesty, responsibility, and humility with her usual warped definitions. Under the section titled Impeccable Honesty, she tells a story about a couple who is divorcing, probably due to Jodi's couples counseling, and somehow the husband got the judge to issue an order declaring that the wife had to turn over all of her journals to the husband's lawyer, which is horrifying. Here's what Jodi wrote about it. We went back and forth as she worked out the caliber of her character. After much deliberation, she stated with a powerful voice, "I will not hide. I have nothing to be afraid of. Yes, it will be embarrassing for me to hear my sacred and personal thoughts tossed around in a room full of greed and arrogance, but I will not lose my character or my conscience in the process of losing control over my personal journals." Days later, she was asked to make copies of every page and turn them over to the court, which she reports she did. Every page! She's obsessed with people's deepest thoughts and feelings being exposed. She tells another story about herself in the responsibility section. Apparently Jodi likes to drive too fast, and she got her first speeding ticket just days after getting her license. Then she got ticket after ticket until her license was suspended for 3 months. I don't want to read too much into this because lots of teens get speeding tickets, lots of adults get speeding tickets, but I do think there's something a bit antisocial in getting so many speeding tickets that your license is suspended. She writes that she was driving too fast because she was trying to get a lot done, but she also writes, "I felt unique and special and told myself that I did not need to drive like everyone else did." How interesting that she doesn't feel she has to obey the rules. She's going to say that she went through a repentance process, but we've seen that she also believes to this day that she shouldn't have to follow the rules other people follow. Also, she said in the first chapter that she was always incredibly obedient, but we see from this story, and from several others that she's going to tell later, that she was not an angelic, obedient young person. I humbled myself and took full responsibility for my choices. I went through a repentance process where I acknowledged all the many times I justified, blamed, resented, and gossiped about the law and how unfair it was. I felt a softening in my heart towards the intentions of the law. I choose to believe that the law is driven by a desire to keep drivers safe and that I can participate in that outcome as well. If she previously didn't believe that speed limits exist to protect drivers and passengers, why did she think they exist? In the humility section, we get one of the most bizarre stories in this book. The first time I read this, I gave myself a headache making this face. I still find this so strange, but it's an amazing insight into how Jodi manipulates others. After 2 long days of fun in the sun, playing on a boat with some girlfriends at a nearby reservoir, my friend Bev received an unexpected phone call she was unprepared to manage, physically or emotionally. We were headed out on a Friday morning for another day of sunbathing, water splashing, and laughter when she answered her husband's call at 10:36 a.m. He shared the news of his father's unexpected death at 4:08 that morning, and the oldest brother's unwillingness to share the details of their father's death with their mother. The mother still did not know her husband was dead, and the oldest brother was attempting to control the situation by hiding their father's body and refusing to allow other siblings to see and pay their respects. Bev's husband shared the grim news that weeks before his father's death, the oldest son in the family became the executor of his father's will, money, and estate through blackmail. Finally, the oldest brother did not want anyone calling or coming to see him, his mother, or the deceased father. He insisted that he would take care of his father's funeral and inform everyone after the body was interred. Okay, so obviously this is a really strange situation with Bev's in-laws. It sounds like her brother-in-law is attempting to steal from his family, and also just being a real dick. The women on vacation continued to receive updates throughout the day, and Jodi brings this up repeatedly, how Bev was continuously upset about the situation. Although she never says it outright, Jodi's narrative carries an undercurrent of irritation. At one point, she writes that Bev had had 5 days of constant validation and understanding, as if the good time they had during the first part of the vacation should have immunized them from this drama. In one of our private conversations, I took a stance with her that I'd taken before and knew that she would respond well to. I invited her to humble herself. You might be asking yourself, what in the world does she need to become humble about? This is about the unstable oldest brother and not about her. However, the only person I was concerned about was my friend, and how she was stuck inside her lack of humility and unwillingness to vulnerably recognize truth rather than distortion. She needed to become humble in order to exit the painful cycle of control and fear. As I sat with her, I asked, Bev, do you feel entitled to bury your father-in-law's body where you want? Do you feel entitled to his money and estate? Do you feel entitled to force this brother to do what you want because you think you are right? I sat with my friend as I watched her contemplate the questions of entitlement. Almost immediately, she began crying tears of sorrow and remorse. She felt penitent and was curious as to how to make it right. She verbalized her awareness that she had indeed felt entitled to do things her way, and that it wasn't until she heard the word entitled that she jerked awake from the illusion she'd been in for 5 days. She desired to forgive her brother-in-law and surrender all that was not in her control. She made plans to speak with her spouse about having their own service to celebrate his father's life, and completely let go of any expectations they had of his brother. So humility means letting your brother-in-law steal with you, lie to his mother, and possibly cover up evidence of foul play in your father-in-law's death? What? Reading between the lines, it sounds like Jodi was irritated that her vacation was being dominated by discussion of Bev's situation, so she shamed Bev and called her entitled and convinced her that it wasn't appropriate for her to respond to the situation in any way. What kind of friend is that? And I can see why Bev fell for it. Jodi is almost right. Control is an illusion, and sometimes we can't change a situation. Sometimes we don't have that power, and sometimes we have to accept that we can't fix it. But to tell Bev to not even bother trying to fix her family's problems is being a terrible friend. A few pages later, she mentions another friend, Pam. I assume this is Pam Bodger, but I can't say for certain. What a rare jewel to know someone who can conduct themselves in peace and integrity. My dear friend Pam is one of those gems. She is the epitome of connection. I have known her for many years, and she has given me evidence of safety that tells me that I will be heard regardless of what I share with her. What if what I share is, I don't want to clean your house, Pam?
I did make her scrub the floor and they vacuumed.
Were these girls getting paid? Were they doing it out of the goodness of their hearts? Or were they being labor trafficked, as we have to say on YouTube? We know almost nothing about what was happening in the lives of these young women during this time, and I don't want to invade their privacy, but I will say I found this video concerning. Also, Pam Bodger is reportedly in possession of the Pen Papers, a collection of revelations that Jodi and Ruby and probably Pam dictated. I'm very curious about what those revelations say. Jerry Frankie shared that her mother and Jodi love visions of glory. Just like Chad and Lori, just like Tim Ballard. There's a brief mention here of a legal situation. I was working with an attorney as a result of being accused of something I had not done. I was devastated by the allegations and blatant lies that were being told about me, my actions, and more importantly, my character. I don't know how many times Jodi has been sued, but I'm going to speculate that this passage refers to the situation she got into with Adam Paul Steed. Adam has done quite a few interviews, including one that lasted more than 5 hours on Mormon Stories, and he appeared in the curious case of Jodi Hildebrandt on Max, and he's a very charismatic fellow. He and his wife went to Jodi for counseling. Jodi decided he was addicted to watching porn, and then she reported that to the BYU Honor Code office and got Adam expelled. Adam's experience is such a perfect example of how Jodi behaves. He actually has text messages of Jodi explaining to his wife how to manipulate social workers and the legal system. And he got Jodi's license suspended for 18 months for violating HIPAA. That's why she switched to life coaching, which is unregulated. The particular nature of what she did, reporting confidential information and also just lies, to the Honor Code office is part of a pattern. Somebody, no idea who, but God bless them, bought JodiHildebrandt.com and made a website about her that includes dozens of interviews from people she treated like crap in therapy. There is a theme in those reviews. Well, there are a few themes, but one I couldn't help noticing was lack of confidentiality. She told all her clients all her other clients' business. She gossiped. She shared secrets. Reviewer Jenny Hansen wrote, I began researching her to discover that her license has been affected for HIPAA violations, and sadly, she didn't learn her lesson. I witnessed this firsthand when my sister had confided in her with a private matter during an appointment session, which later surfaced and negatively affected relationships and even trickled into my workplace. Gossip got around our community that was blown out of proportion. Save your money and sanity. Find a quality specialist with real credentials, and possibly good reviews. Love the snark, Jenny. I think that this pattern fits into Jodi's obsession with self-exposure. No one is allowed to have any privacy. Except Jodi, of course. Jodi tells a story about a couple with whom she worked, and the story seems to act as a sort of advertisement for Jodi's Connections program. The woman's name is Raquel, but the husband is never given a name. After 29 years of marriage, Raquel caught her husband cheating on her. Jodi told them they needed to separate, so the husband moved out. For 2 years. During those 2 years, they both did counseling with Jodi. They attended their weird gender-divided groups. They made their endless daily calls to report on themselves. And then they got back together. And 10 years later, they're happier than ever. The story isn't that remarkable in and of itself, other than the 2-year separation, I suppose. What I think is noteworthy is that we have numerous reports now of Jodi actually doing this with couples, and every single one of them has ended in divorce. Even Ruby ended up divorced, and she was Jodi's right-hand woman at Connections. One reviewer on JodiHildebrandt.com said he personally knew 10 couples who divorced after counseling with Jodi. Michael Tillman, Adam Paulsteed, Brian Tibbetts, they all ended up divorced. And what's most interesting about that is that all of the men who've come forward have said that their ex-wives are still invested in Jodi. All the women still believe in her and believe in the Connections dogma. I don't want to feed into the stereotype of the man-hating lesbian, because I've known a lot of lesbians, and I can't think of one who expressed hatred for men. But Jodi might be the exception. She might be the reason the stereotype exists. She does genuinely seem to hate men. She told Jessi many times that working with men meant battling Satan on a daily basis. I have a sneaking suspicion that she was making couples separate in part because she couldn't bear the thought of them being together intimately. I also wonder if she targeted the marriages of women she found attractive, which, if so, is diabolical. Thus ends Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Eternal Principles That Govern Connection. Yeah, we're back to the eternal principles she discussed in Rings of Responsibility. You know, eternal principles like ripe and seasons. She goes off on honesty, responsibility, and humility again. Then she says, how comfortable would you be if all of your thoughts and feelings were on display for others to see and hear? What would you look like if you were mentally and emotionally exposed? If you were vulnerable to others' view, to know and evaluate your private thoughts and feelings, how would you choose? As before, we see this fixation on the lack of privacy. I tried to think of a word to describe it and couldn't find one. It goes further than transparency or honesty. I think that exposure is the closest word I found. My question is, in what circumstance will we ever be forced to share all of our thoughts and feelings with others? When would this ever happen? And why does Jodi want us to live like it could? It's exactly like Zoe said when she looked at Jodi's book for kids. Nobody sees your thoughts. You can be not honest with them. And I'm not advocating for dishonest thinking, but I can't figure out why Jodi is pushing this idea, this ideal of self-exposure. It feels like a power play. I'm curious, is she ever completely emotionally exposed? Or does she use this principle of honesty as a way to manipulate others while exempting herself? She spends the rest of this chapter discussing the difference between truth and true. Essentially, it's a difference in capitalization. Thus ends chapter 3. Chapter 4, what is disconnection? This chapter begins with a terrible diagram. Another terrible diagram. Jodi is not a visual thinker, but seems to believe she is. She isn't being impeccably honest about her inability to think visually. Speaking of which, this is a diagram from Arming the Next Generation with Weapons of Truth, and I can't make heads or tails of it. What am I looking at? Self-care and not liking mustard are immature, sensual forms of love? But sexual touching and physiological sensations are mature love? I'm not even sure if this is a chart or a graph, let alone what the different quadrants and or axes might mean. Is it 2 diagrams or one big one? I don't know what either of these diagrams mean, but Jodi believes that the one in You Are Not Not Enough has something to do with disconnection. To demonstrate a life of disconnection, she tells a story about a former client of hers named Scott. Given how little respect she has for people's confidentiality, I can assume that almost everything in this story is true. Except for her son, every story she tells in this book about men is negative. Scott grew up in an unhealthy home and began drinking as a child. As an adult, he traveled a lot for work, and during these trips he cheated on his wife with both men and women and spent large sums of money gambling. He also had a secret second family on the other side of the world. It was always curious to me why he continued to come back and see me, because I confronted him constantly, yet he was consistent about his appointments. I did all I knew how to do to assist this poor, distorted soul back into truth, but he was not willing to honestly confront the consequences of his choices. We already know Jodi's therapeutic techniques don't work based on outcomes, but here, Jodi almost admits as much. In fact, a lot of the stories she tells are about people who wouldn't do what she said, and as a result, didn't change. This particular story, though, reminds me of one that she told on Tom Harrison's Eternal Core podcast, and I want to play a clip from it.
My first client where I practiced these principles was a alcoholic and a drug addict, and he was a multi-millionaire, very powerful man, and nobody confronted him. And I was, late 20s, early 30s. I was nobody in his world, and he was in treatment. And I remember him becoming very angry one day and going off on his wife and his children and blaming everybody in his life for his problems. And I heard very clearly in my mind, confront him. And I was like, I don't know. He's really mad. I don't think that'll be good. And it was, again, confront him. And so I don't remember exactly what I said to him, but I followed that guidance. And I remember him sitting back. I said something along the lines of like, all right, yeah, you've had a hard life. And yeah, this and this and this happened. And your wife loves you and you have 3 children at home. And, and I just started speaking truth to him. And he sat back and it was silent after I got done. And I thought, oh my gosh, what did I just do? I'm going to get fired. And he looked at me and said, how dare you? And I said, that's the truth. What you were speaking was not the truth. That is the truth. And I stood in my position, and my supervisor came in about 30 minutes later, and she goes, Jodi, I don't know you. And she said, but you're going to be a really good therapist. Said a few expletives to me. And she said, and don't do that again. Like, don't confront people like that again, because it really upset him. He wants you fired. But that's where it all started. And, you know, to tell you, 5 years later, I got an email from that man, and he said, Jodi, no one had ever confronted me in my life like that. And he said, and that's why I was sick. You were the only one that had the guts to tell me the truth. And that is why I got well. And I said, well, you were nasty and you were mean and you scared me. And he's like, thank you for loving me enough to tell me the truth. You always were honest with me.
The reason I think this story is interesting is that it demonstrates Jodi's unwavering belief in the power of confrontation. She really believes that telling people her unvarnished opinion of them will break them down to the point that they'll have some kind of transformative insight and change. And I think most of us know intuitively that this won't work. It didn't work for Dr. Phil. It didn't work for Jodi. It just doesn't work. In fact, I'm skeptical that this story Jodi told on the Eternal Core podcast really happened. The only part that rings true to me is the ending, where her supervisor tells her not to do that again. We all know that being brutally honest with someone usually ends poorly. It's like that old Seinfeld episode where George's girlfriend convinces him to tell her the truth about why he's breaking up with her.
It's not you!
I want the truth!
The truth? You want the truth? It is your earrings! It is your chocolates! But it's so much more! You're pretentious!
The woman leaves the diner and checks into a depression clinic, and it's no wonder why. Hearing negative things about ourselves is hard, and it's probably even harder if those things are true. That's why therapists don't hit their clients with brutal honesty. They just kind of nudge us into seeing ourselves more clearly. This sort of confrontation isn't good for people. But Jodi refuses to accept that. I validated him and validated him. I spoke the truth to him and invited him to choose differently. For months, I invited him to choose to clean up this wreckage by choosing to be honest, responsible, and humble, and every time he refused. Sometimes he would be very overt about his unwillingness, and other times quite passive. He acted like there was no hope for him. I assured him repeatedly that he could clean all of this up and have peace in his life, but he wanted to control the lies and keep his wife in the picture, and therefore he would not tell anyone. Not only is she admitting that her techniques don't work, that inviting him to humble didn't accomplish anything, but the last sentence makes it clear that the only option she gave him for how to change his life was a full confession. He refused to tell his wife that he was cheating on her and blowing their money in casinos, and also that she wasn't his only wife. It's another example of Jodi's belief that you have to expose yourself and your secrets to others. And the most serious issue I see in it is that it demonstrates that Jodi wasn't on her client's side. Was the best thing for this man to confess to his wife and watch their life together fall apart? Or could he have gained enough self-insight to make changes that would have allowed him to stop cheating and gambling and be a better husband and father? Could a better therapist, one who was more interested in improving Scott's well-being than in publicly exposing him, have actually helped him? Because Jodi didn't. After 6 months, Scott quit treatment. 5 years after that, Jodi learned that Scott had taken off one day on a business trip and nobody ever heard from him again. I guess he went to live with his family on the other side of the world. Maybe he had a nicer therapist over there too. Jodi gets into how disconnection is numbness and distortion creates disconnection, and how everyone is either erring on the side of self-adulation or self-denigration. You know, more than half of the Amazon reviews of this book contain the expression word salad. Thus ends Chapter 4. Chapter 5, Connection versus Disconnection. This chapter is only 2 pages long. In it, Jodi tells a story about how she was moving her office and offered 2 of her friends her office furniture and decorations. One friend was incredibly grateful, accepted the items on time, and helped Jodi clean up the empty office. The other friend was late, asked to reschedule, and only verbally thanked Jodi instead of sending a card. Sounds like a Goofus and Gallant comic. What this story reveals is the pointlessness of the words connection and disconnection. We don't need jargon to describe why Jodi enjoyed one of these interactions more than the other. Thus ends Chapter 5. Chapter 6, Vulnerability. Jodi opens this chapter with a story about how, when she was 15 years old, she got caught letting a friend cheat off of her on a math test. Then she got suspended for 3 days. This is another piece of evidence that she was not as perfectly obedient as she claims. The most remarkable thing about the story is how entirely unremarkable it is. Jessi mentioned in their interview with Mormon Stories podcast that Jodi tried to get one of her high school teachers fired. I wonder if it was related to this situation. Also, how is this an example of vulnerability? After a long list of more situations that Jodi says make us vulnerable, some of which do, the chapter ends. Chapter 7. I don't know what's going on with the pacing of this book at this point. Chapter 6 was 4 pages long, but Chapter 7, Motives, is only a page and a half. Jodi describes a strange hypothetical in which a mechanic could have many different motives for finishing a job on time because she thinks people don't know what motives are. Thus ends Chapter 7. Chapter 8, Perceptions. This chapter is 5 pages long, and Jodi spends more than a page of it telling a pretty pointless story about how one day somebody spooked her by cop knocking on her office door while she was in a session. I don't know why, but Jodi jumped to the conclusion that the person knocking intended to harm her, and was shocked when it turned out to be a flower delivery person. She presents this as a lesson about perceptions, but it's actually a story about assumptions. I'm not sure Jodi knows the difference. Which she again demonstrates with this story. I met someone who was drunk and having a hard time perceiving accurately. I said, "I'm sorry. That doesn't sound comfortable to be altered with alcohol." He replied, "Oh, I feel very comfortable and relaxed. I like it this way." This verbal exchange was full of differing perceptions. Who's right? I think if you were to ask either of us, we would each reply, "I am." Why would someone who is altered with alcohol say they feel comfortable and relaxed and prefer life this way? She doesn't explain the circumstances of this meeting. I'm guessing she met this person at a party and they admitted they were drunk, and she condescendingly told them she felt sorry for them for being drunk, and they laughed and said, "Why? I feel relaxed and happy." And then Jodi spent 2 weeks getting high on the scent of her own farts and congratulating herself on being morally superior to this sad alcoholic. That's how I imagine it anyway. Thus ends Chapter 8. Chapter 9, Emotions. Most of Chapter 9 is taken up by a story about the time Jodi nearly drowned while learning to wakeboard. I initially took this story at face value, because I've never wakeboarded. I wasn't even sure what it was, honestly, only that you do it on a lake. It turns out it's like a cross between water skiing and snowboarding. You put on boots that attach to a board, and then you get towed behind a boat while it goes really fast. Pretty simple. I guess there's some versions where you just stand on the board, but Jodi specifies that she was doing the variety with boots, and it's sort of relevant. She says that she loves going out on the lake in the summer, and that she owns a boat. She had tried to learn over and over to wakeboard, but she could never manage to stand up on the board, which would seem to be the first step. On this particular occasion, she actually managed to stand up for the first time ever, and then immediately pitched too far forward and face planted in the water while being dragged across the lake by the boat. I was now in a position that I had never been in before, and was struggling mightily to arch my back enough to keep my face out of the water. The positioning of my feet locked into the board made it impossible to use my legs at all to sustain me, and I immediately knew I was in trouble. I knew that I could drown by the time they pulled the boat back around if I did not flip my board around and get it right side up. Jodi realizes that she's in deep trouble and only has one shot at righting herself, so she says a prayer and then rolls over in the water. I have not shared that story until now. mostly because I was in an emotional, physical, and spiritual haze for hours as I quietly rowed back to the dock. I was coming back into reality of the seriousness of the events that had taken place, and I did not have the energy to explain what had just happened. It was a private, highly emotional experience between me, the water, and God. I thought this was a little much, but mostly I was just perplexed by the purpose of sharing the story. Apparently it's to demonstrate that we, have emotions. She thought the best way to explain that we all have emotions was to spend 4 pages recounting a time when she felt something, which would seem to have implications. But then I decided to watch a couple of wakeboarding videos in order to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Turns out GoPro has a YouTube channel with wakeboarding videos made on Lake Powell, which is the same lake Jodi specifies this took place on. And it was within the first, 10, 15 seconds of watching them that I realized something that's probably obvious to anyone who has actual experience wakeboarding or water skiing. All Jodi needed to do to avoid drowning was let go of the rope. That's it. She didn't need to pray. She didn't need to execute some complex maneuver against the pummeling of the current. If you're face down in the water, being dragged at high speed by a boat, let go of the rope. Why did she present this story in such a dramatic fashion? I'm not sure. Honestly, given the company she keeps, I half expected her to claim it was a near-death experience. She still might. Just like Chad Daybell's near-death experiences, it involved water. And I wonder if she was setting this up to later characterize as an NDE, because it doesn't make any sense to me that she told it to demonstrate that people have feelings. That statement is so blatantly obvious that it can stand on its own without being backed up by examples. But not only does she spend pages setting up the story and telling it, she describes it as a horrific experience and makes repeated references to God and how her life was saved. It feels NDE coded, and it again makes me wonder exactly what's in the pen papers. Thus ends Chapter 9. Chapter 10, Choice. This chapter begins by discussing how we can make choices in life, how even refusing to choose is a choice. But then Jodi undermines that entire argument by pointing out that our choices don't affect many things in our lives. At least I think that's what she's trying to say, via the most bafflingly random set of examples. Remember, our enoughness doesn't vary according to our choices. Imagine how absurd it would be to say that if I choose to lie to my mother about where I am, then that means I will no longer be 5 feet 9 inches tall. Or if I choose to gossip about my brother, then that means I will no longer be born on June 20th, 1985. It is just as absurd to believe that if I choose to steal gum from the store, then that means my very divinity will change. Or if I choose to speak unkind words to my friend, then that means I am no longer a child of God. All of these statements are an impossibility. This is why people keep bringing up the idea of word salad when reviewing this book. Incidentally, I've now read enough of Jodi's writing that it's starting to not make sense to me, but I'm starting to understand how all the concepts fit together. Her ideas aren't logical, but they are consistent in a certain way. So as a certified Jodi translator, I can tell you that the point she's trying to make here is that nothing we can do can change the fact that God loves us. I don't actually disagree with that idea. Now, she's inadvertently suggested that God's love for us is somehow based on our height, but that's just because she's a terrible writer. I don't have any deep insights into this quote, I just had to read it because it's so bonkers. She discusses how one of the most important choices we can make is to not take things personally, which she always leaves the ly off of. It's always not take things personal. And she tells a story about how when she was selling her house, potential buyer felt she was asking too much for it. Jodi lost her mind over this, apparently. I reacted poorly, gratefully not in front of him. I was offended, upset, and insulted by how inconsiderate he was being by disregarding the house's amenities as I saw them. My realtor was helpful because she took the personal out of it for me. She validated me and then helped me see that I was making all sorts of assumptions around his motives. What's interesting is that she presents this anecdote like it's relatable, like most people would take a lowball offer on a house as a personal insult. Had she ever even met this man? How could his offer be a personal insult if he'd never met her? My bet is he lowballed her because the house was hideously decorated, just like the house in Ivan's, and that's what she took personally. Thus ends chapter 10. Chapter 11, Triggers. Jodi has apparently abandoned the expression personally pricked, which she used in Rings of Responsibility in place of triggers, and she's now just calling them triggers. I gather that for a while, though, she was calling it getting poked on the Connections podcast. Why is all of this so SUal? Most of this chapter is taken up with a story about Jodi's trip to Egypt, which, okay, I'm personally pricked by this story. I have always dreamed of going to Egypt. Never thought I'd be jealous of Jodi Hildebrandt. There it is. Jodi tells this story about going to Egypt with her son. This is the second story in which she's mentioned him, so I don't know if their estrangement came later or if Sherry Frankie was incorrect that he and Jodi don't speak. I can't say. They appear to have been on good terms when they went to Egypt together. Although for some reason they went during the hottest part of the year, and they went to see the Great Pyramid of Giza. Jodi says it was about 120 degrees inside the pyramid, which sounds miserable. There's a long hallway you have to go through in order to get to the central chamber inside, and I managed to find what I think is footage of this passage. This footage is from Phil Carr's YouTube channel, which I'll link below.
Oh, yeah, you gotta take one more step forward. That's too close. I got you.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Oh.
So yeah, that looks fairly miserable. Although Jodi claims repeatedly that you have to crawl on your knees, which seems to be an exaggeration. I couldn't find any footage of people actually crawling through here. Anyway, Jodi flipped out halfway up this hallway. She got really claustrophobic and hot and started dripping sweat, and she ended up having a little panic attack and crying and going back outside before she ever reached the central chamber. As far as I can tell, the entire purpose of this story is to give an example of being triggered. Being triggered used to mean that you had a negative reaction to something that provoked memories of a prior traumatic experience, but it seems like these days people use it to mean getting upset about anything, and that's how Jodi's using it. She even specifies she's never been claustrophobic before. And her point seems to be people get triggered sometimes. People get upset. It's pretty deep. Thus ends chapter 11. Chapter 12, Pain. Jodi launches into an explanation of inevitable pain versus optional pain that is about 15% more coherent than her flag football versus tackle football analogy in Rings of Responsibility. Then she tells a story about an incident from her youth, which she claims is an example of both inevitable and optional pain. And I'm going to ignore that aspect of it because it's blatherskite, but the story is interesting. And I'll say, this is probably the story she does the best job of telling. The writing here is noticeably better than usual. She describes how, when she was 15, she was home alone with a friend named Steve, and they were making hamburgers. Halfway through, Jodi realized she didn't have any buns, so Steve said he'd run to the store. As he left, a storm broke and rain began pouring down. Jodi was anxious about being home alone, even briefly, on a dark and stormy night. Because at the time, Tucson was being terrorized by a criminal known as the primetime R-wordist. This is actually a case I've heard of before. The perpetrator's name was Brian Frederick LaRiva. At least they believe it was. He ended his own life rather than be arrested, so he was never convicted. But basically, he'd break into people's homes, usually during primetime television viewing hours, tie up the men, and assault the women in front of them. Sometimes he'd rob them, too, and sometimes he'd call later and threaten them. And this guy was prolific. The police have identified over 30 separate attacks and over 90 victims. All of which is to say that it wasn't crazy of Jodi to be worried about the guy. While she was waiting for Steve to return with the hamburger buns, the phone rang. She answered it, but there was no one on the line, which freaked her out. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. She answered it. This time, a voice on the other end said, "I'm in the house." Now, Jodi says this happened in 1985, so the movie that made the idea of the calls coming from inside the house, When a Stranger Calls, was released 6 years before this incident. Jodi was probably familiar with this, but she either didn't recognize it or she was just too freaked out to realize that the use of this phrase suggests a prank. She panicked. She put the phone down on the hall table without hanging it up and headed for the kitchen to get a big knife. But halfway there, the phone rang again. Right as I reached the end of the hallway, the impossible happened. The phone rang. I stopped dead in my tracks and thought, okay, that's impossible. I just took the phone off the hook. The only way for that to happen would be for the phone to be placed back on the cradle. My thoughts continued. He's in that back bedroom, and he must have reached out of the door that I was just standing next to and put the phone back on the base after I walked away. I was too scared to turn around, and so in my dazed, adrenaline-pumping state, I walked into the kitchen as the phone continued to ring. I grabbed the biggest butcher's knife we had and walked back over and stood at the base of the hallway, facing all of the closed doors, knowing he was behind one of them. I saw at the top of the hallway that the phone had indeed been hung up, which confirmed he was in my home, and I was going to take him out. I have to admit, I probably would have been freaked out at that point, too. I can't really fault Jodi for that. I probably would have grabbed the big knife and gone right out the back door to a neighbor's house. But Jodi got the big shiny knife and then decided to confront the person in her home, which is pretty ballsy, and also ill-advised. She carried her butcher's knife back down the hall and shouted, "Come out!" And a voice replied, "Jodi, I'm coming out." And one of the bedroom doors in the hallway slowly opened, and out came my little brother, Timmy. I could tell he was surprised when he saw the knife raised over my head, but he walked out boldly and casually said, "Are you crazy? What are you doing with a knife?" I was in a trance, trying to process the sudden shift. I was so overcome with the intensity of fear that I was not thinking clearly or rationally. As he walked out of the doorway, I lowered my arm and dropped the knife on the carpet. I began to involuntarily cry and shake. As he approached me with his arrogant swagger, I lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. I jumped on top of him and started pummeling him with all my might. He was underneath me, and I was out of control with fear and rage. I was swinging in a way that I was not conscious of the damage I was doing. I understand why Jodi was upset. I understand why she was angry, but I can't understand why she felt it was acceptable to beat the living daylights out of her brother in response to what was obviously a prank. And it's not one of those situations where she reacted before realizing it was her brother. Jodi admits she recognized him, but she started wailing on him anyway. The next thing I knew, Steve came out of the room as he heard all of the commotion and was pulling me off of Timmy, saying, "Jodi, stop, you're hurting him." I began swinging at Steve as I screamed at both of them. "How could you do this? How could you do this to me?" Apparently, when Steve went to get the buns, he bumped into Timmy, who was being dropped off at the house, and they decided to prank Jodi by crawling into the bedroom through a window. Additionally, Steve had his father's Carr phone, a very early cordless model, and that's how they called her from inside the house. On a side, Jodi says she'd never heard of a mobile phone before this incident. The next morning, Jodi's parents demanded to know why she beat up her own brother. I tried explaining what happened to my parents, yet they were only interested in Timmy being hurt and me taking responsibility for his wounds. As I walked out of my parents' room, I remember thinking, here I am again, alone in this world, and knowing that there was no one to protect me or validate me in my experiences. The use of the word wounds here suggests to me that she actually hit him hard enough to break the skin. And yet, she makes it clear that she felt, both now and then, that she was the victim. I'm not saying what Steve and Timmy did was nice or okay or harmless fun. It was a jerk move, and Timmy probably should have been grounded or at least forced to apologize. But this mean-spirited prank in no way justified getting the crap kicked out of it. And that fact isn't acknowledged anywhere in this story. The fact that Jodi can't see, even 40 years out from this incident, that violence was an overreaction is really telling. The way she writes this makes it sound like not only does she not regret pounding on her younger brother, she's still mad at him and her parents, and probably Steve too. And that's some epic grudge holding. Thus ends chapter 12. Chapter 13 contains no personal stories, so I'm going to skip to the last chapter, chapter 14, Connection is Love. This chapter contains a story about Jodi's relationship with her daughter. It's the first and only time her daughter is mentioned in any of Jodi's writing, and the story she tells is suspiciously lacking in content. She first claims that she and her 2 children had a great relationship until her daughter became a teenager. As my daughter began her teenage years, she spent, as many teenagers do, more time with friends, yet these friends did not uphold similar values as I did. Where I had once been the cool mom that she was excited to introduce to her friends, now, in her eyes, I became a drag, not in the know, and overly cautious of too many things. If I could sum it up from my perspective, she was spending time with people who made choices in distortion rather than truth. As a result, I began to notice her anger at my interpretations of her choices, and she would react from a place of control, whereas previously she had not. This reminded me of both Tylee Ryan and Sherry Frankie, honestly. The teenage years are notorious for being the time in life when we begin to second-guess our parents, and that naturally leads to a lot of conflict. But I think it's a red flag when parents can't accept that their own behavior, when seen with a fresh set of youthful eyes, is sometimes less than ideal, and both Tylee and Sherry fell afoul of that. It looks like Jodi's daughter did too. I could tell I was losing her to a world of money, flashy things, friends who were still quite young and unaware, social media, and a hyper-focus on her physical presentation, none of which she was interested in much before. 2 months before she was ready to complete her junior year of high school, she announced that she was moving in with her father because it was too difficult to live with me. She left on a Sunday afternoon. Yeah, so none of Jodi's daughter's criticisms were legit. It was all because of social media and materialism. And I'm sure she didn't learn any of that from her mother, the YouTuber who lived alone in a 9,000 square foot house and owned a boat. No, blame it on the Kardashians. At some point after Ruby Frankie converted her channel from 8 passengers to Moms of Truth, she put out an Instagram post that's incredibly similar to Jodi's accusations against her daughter. The post was a message to Ruby's followers, and in it Ruby said, "The only abuse I am guilty of is giving my children whatever they wanted whenever they asked. Almost to the day I began holding boundaries with my children, my illusion on YouTube began to fall apart. I did a great disservice to you. I led you to believe that happiness can be found in excess, indulgence, and gratifying wants." She's claiming the exact same thing about her own children that Jodi is claiming about her daughter, right? All these fancy phones and vacations and crock charms are ruining the children. I don't know if Jodi convinced her that this was the case, or if pop culture is just still the #1 scapegoat among bad parents, but the fact that Ruby is claiming she gave her kids anything they wanted is wild, given that the woman refused to pack her kindergartner a lunch. Jodi writes a full 1.5 pages about how she felt after her daughter left, but she manages to avoid actually saying much of anything. I was confused. I was really confused. I went into major optional pain and blamed myself for hours, which turned into days, which turned into years for the reasons and the issues she gave for wanting to leave. Every time I thought about what she had told me, "I just can't live with you anymore," I turned it into evidence of how bad I was as a mother. I thought once she left that I would see her on the weekends, but she refused to talk with me, see me, or interact with me. It's been 10 years, and she is still in a space where she is not wanting any contact. I think anyone whose child leaves home and cuts off all contact is going to go into a tailspin of trying to figure out what happened. But note that Jodi describes this as optional pain. This is from the earlier chapter on pain. Optional pain is avoidable. It comes from the stories, lies, that you tell yourself about your experiences, conclusions, expectations, perceptions, interpretations, and assumptions about what those experiences mean about you. These stories, which are not the truth, are the inner dialogue you hear about yourself and others, which are reinforced by deeply held, distorted thoughts about your worth and value. What Jodi is saying here is that all of her self-recriminating thoughts were lies. Every time she thought about how she might have contributed to the situation that led to her daughter leaving, she was caught up in distortion. That was all misguided. Returning to the narrative about her daughter, she writes, "Initially, this experience completely caught me off guard, and I chose to see myself as a victim, trying to control what I did or did not do to make her leave, what I did or did not give to her, what I did or did not teach her, and on and on. Every time I thought of her, it forced me to look deeply at myself and why this was happening. For months, I scoured every interaction I had with her and wondered if I would have done this, or changed that, or said this or that, then maybe she would not have left. I put myself through emotional torture full of what ifs. Yet the outcome was always the same. She was gone and unwilling to see or interact with me. The pain of a child turning from truth, from love, from connection, is a type of pain that words are scarce to describe." Frankly, if you have a child cut off contact for 10 years, you probably should spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I'm not saying it's always the parent's fault. I'm just saying that any time a relationship is completely fractured that way, it's worth considering why. But Jodi is suggesting that there was no point in doing a relationship autopsy because it wouldn't change the fact that her daughter wanted no contact. That's her idea of truth. She's not wrong that it might not change the outcome, but it might have allowed her to grow in ways that would prevent relationships from falling apart in the future. I also want to point out this last sentence, which is just crazy to me. The pain of a child turning from truth, from love, from connection, is a type of pain that words are scarce to describe. Jodi's daughter didn't turn away from truth. She turned away from Jodi. Jodi is describing herself as truth and love. And that fits perfectly with Jodi's obvious aspirations to be a prophet. Something that's been of interest to me recently is estrangement between children and parents. There's a blog that I'll link below that talks about the differences observed in forums for estranged children versus forums for estranged parents. The children are specific about the reasons for the estrangement. They discuss concrete incidents, recount conversations as exactly as possible, and demand accuracy and reasonableness from each other. The parents, on the other hand, are vague. They frequently claim not to understand why their children have cut contact. They claim the children never told them, and the stories they recount contain obvious omissions and emotional reasoning. Unsurprisingly, Jodi's story about why her daughter cut contact is vague. All we learn is that the daughter was seduced by materialism and social media and then left without explaining why. I would venture a guess that there were both specific incidents and ongoing issues that led to this decision, and that Jodi's daughter told her exactly what the problems were. Jodi's response, though, is entirely about herself. She never tries to imagine the situation from her daughter's point of view. It's all about Jodi, what she did, what she didn't do, what she could have done. As months turned into years, I was willing to humble myself and insert truth into this experience. Through the help of my own loving, truthful support system, I have been able to reframe from my end what the reality was, repent for my own distortions, and receive forgiveness from a loving God for the choices I made as a parent. I have been able to separate myself from my daughter's choices and accept her, in the truth, right where she is. This acceptance means I don't make up stories about her perceptions or motivations, which allows me to connect with her instead of control her in my mind. I now have the skills to truly love her, which means I don't want anything from her, and I accept that the life she is living is exactly what she wants and chooses. Sorry. There's so much in this paragraph that feels deceptive. First, the phrase, I have been able to reframe from my end what the reality was. If you reframe reality, then what you're looking at is no longer reality. That suggests to me that what Jodi really did was change her interpretation of what had happened. She decided on a story she could live with, which is all the more remarkable given this sentence. This acceptance means I don't make up stories about her perceptions or motivations. I feel very confident if we were to ask Jodi's daughter if she cut contact with her mother for more than a decade because she was mad she didn't get an iPhone, the answer would be no. But that's what Jodi implied just a page ago when she wasn't speculating about her daughter's motivations. But this is the sentence that made my jaw drop and occasionally makes me crack up when I'm reading. I now have the skills to truly love her, which means I don't want anything from her. It just gets me. I love her so much, I don't ever want to see her again. I mean, presumably, Jodi was saying that she wasn't asking her daughter for anything. But having no expectations of someone isn't really love either. That, of course, is what Jodi believes. In Arming the Next Generation, Jodi's very forthright about the idea that loving other people means giving them everything we have and taking nothing for ourselves. There is no taking inside of a loving attraction. Loving attraction only produces the desire to give of oneself and to serve others. That's not realistic. That's not how human relationships work. To some degree, all relationships are transactional. And I know that's a dirty word these days, but that's reality. And how is this supposed to work in an actual relationship? Like, you're both always giving selflessly, but neither of you is ever allowed to take? It reminds me of two people both insisting the other is prettier. You're prettier. No, you're prettier. Don't be silly. You're obviously prettier. Did you notice how fast that started to feel like it was either passive aggression or some kind of manipulative fishing for compliments? If I can't write 3 lines of dialogue based on these principles without my characters devolving into disingenuousness, that's an indication that this relationship dynamic is manipulative. After reading these books and watching everything I could find on Jodi, I don't think she knows what love is. I don't think she's ever felt it. And that's pretty sad. Yes, I do battle internally and waffle at times to use all of my skills. Yet I remind myself that I want for her health and happiness. I have let go of the illusion of her being in my life as an extension to complete me, or make me feel worthy as a mom, or send me a message saying that I am enough. I am centered all by myself, which allows me to be so grateful for the 16 beautiful years I was able to be with her and interact with her. I am thankful and blessed to be the mother of my beautiful daughter. What is this, a eulogy? Note that Jodi inadvertently reveals why she wanted her daughter in her life. To complete me, or to make me feel worthy as a mom, or send me a message saying that I am enough. She continues, love is never about force or coercion, nor does it include any form of fear, control, or deception. At the beginning of my experience with my daughter, I was not loving her. I was full of fear of what her leaving meant about me as a mother, as her mother, and as a woman. The answers that surfaced were full of distortion, which invited me into more distortion and control. I became depressed, anxious, and full of desire to be a better mother for my son, since I had screwed up my daughter so badly. I was a control maniac for a time. As time passed and I realized that no amount of self-loathing or cleaning the house perfectly again was going to bring her back, I began truly learning about love, truth, and connection. It's all still about Jodi. She's too busy asking, but what does her behavior mean about me? To ask, did I hurt her and drive her away? I also think she's hiding a lot behind this statement. I was a control maniac for a time. I've heard that her son changed his last name from his father's name to Jodi's maiden name. I've also heard he's no longer in touch with her. Between that and this statement that she became a control maniac in order to be a better mother to her son, I can't help wondering if she came down really hard on this kid. In narcissistic families, there's often one child who gets designated the black sheep and one who's the golden child. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the dynamic with Jodi's kids. She describes her daughter as materialistic and superficial, but her son as a master at wakeboarding. Neither child gets much description. The only person Jodi really wants to talk about is Jodi. But it strikes me as significant that we only hear positive things about her son and only negative things about her daughter. I wonder, too, if Jodi was competitive with her daughter. I noticed a strong undercurrent of competition between Jodi and Ruby in their connections videos. I have a theory, with no factual support, just a random hunch, that while Jodi is a lesbian, Ruby is straight. I think she entered a romantic relationship with Jodi because Jodi manipulated her, and because, obviously I don't mean this literally, but metaphorically speaking, I think she wanted to suckle from the power teat. Ruby didn't want to be with Jodi. She wanted to be Jodi. She wanted that power and authority. One of the reasons I think this is that Sherry Frankie wrote in her book that she read a few pages of her mother's diary, enough to confirm that Ruby and Jodi were in a relationship, and said that Ruby expressed irritation at having to emotionally support Jodi. She felt like Jodi was clingy. And she's constantly mimicking Jodi in their videos together. Everything from her hairstyle and her clothing to the gestures she uses. It strikes me more as adulation than attraction. But we can't really know unless Ruby decides to explain, and I doubt she ever will. And I actually doubt she'd be honest even if she did. Getting back to Jodi's story, though, the statement that no amount of self-loathing or cleaning the house perfectly would bring her daughter back is inaccurate. If she had paired that self-loathing with a sincere and complete apology, she might have gotten back in her daughter's life. And it appears that she has, or did for a time. I'm not sure. I found this clip from a Connections show on Jordan and McKay's channel. That's them in the corner.
So, for example, I was telling Ruby, my daughter had a birthday the other day, and she was choosing to behave super selfish. And she and I were conversing, and I said, wow. And this was on her birthday. I said this. Wow, I am really sad, and it hurts my heart to watch you behave so selfishly. And Ruby smiled like, wow, you said that on her birthday? And I said, I did. She's like, good job. High five.
Jordan and McKay are great. Please check them out. I don't know exactly when this Connection show was uploaded, but it sounds like Jodi had recently gotten back in touch with her daughter, and then crapped all over the woman on her birthday. As Jordan points out in her video, Jodi made her daughter's birthday party all about herself. And this is exactly the sort of story estranged parents tell. It contains no details. We have no idea what the daughter did that personally pricked Jodi. We have to take Jodi's word that her behavior justified Jodi calling her selfish. And of course I don't. I also want to add that I'm skeptical this woman was really her daughter. Jessi is still close with Jodi's daughter, and they said that Jodi and her daughter have no contact. I wonder if Jodi is still in touch with her son? We've gotten conflicting reports on that. And the woman whose birthday party she ruined is actually her daughter-in-law. I think Jodi Hildebrandt would be the ultimate mother-in-law from hell. Or maybe she just made this story up. One other thing I want to mention from this passage in the book. Why would Jodi think that her daughter might come back if the house was perfectly clean? Is Jodi a bad housekeeper? I'm betting she is. If you look at the police photos and videos from inside Jodi's house, you'll notice that there isn't much in there. This is apparently because Jodi was preparing to move. She'd packed all of her stuff up and put it in storage. But what there is in the house is sort of tossed all over the place. It makes me curious if the house Jodi raised her children in was filthy. Thus ends, You Are Not Not Enough. And that brings us to our final questions. First, what could we have done to make this book better? Well,
My first thought would be a lot.
It's hard to talk about books based on nonsense principles because you can't improve them much without fixing the underlying concepts, and obviously that's way beyond the scope of an editor. If Jodi had asked me to work on this book, though, I would have questioned the inclusion of a lot of these stories. Why do we need a story that demonstrates that people feel things? What do these diagrams mean? Are the readers going to be convinced that Jodi's methods work when she keeps including stories exemplifying that they don't? I'd also revise the word choices. Using words with altered meaning defeats the purpose of having words. They no longer function as common reference points and just become word salad. The first thing I'd fix are those footnotes, and the page numbers, and the table of contents and rings of responsibility. Ugh, good grief. Just get your formatting right, girl. Second, what have we learned about Jodi from reading these books? I'll be honest, I don't feel like I have Jodi figured out. There was a moment when I was working on Chad's books when I felt like I understood him, and the same with Sarah Boone, but there's still a lot about Jodi I can't comprehend. What I feel certain of is that she doesn't have a normal emotional range. I don't think she's ever experienced love. I've seen her laughing, but I've never seen her happy. Most of the time, Jodi appears very angry to me, very defensive, very confrontational. For all her claims that her methodology will lead to a life of peace and joy, I don't see any evidence of that in her. I think she was born with neurological deficiencies into a very unhealthy family and then horrifically mistreated for years. She says that she began repressing memories at a very early age. She grew up in a culture where being herself wasn't acceptable, so she repressed that part of herself and psychologically distanced herself from owning it. And I wonder if this habit of repression prevented her from actually seeing herself clearly. It prevented her from feeling all the emotions, and she doesn't know that. In her defense, how many of us have thought, gee, I wonder if I'm capable of experiencing the full range of human emotions? I mean, I've never asked myself that question, but I think that's part of why she misuses all these words. She's got 35 emotion words, and she's only felt 6 emotions in her entire life. So how does she define the other 29 words? She has to come up with some explanation for why these words exist. So she twists ideas. She combines them in curious ways because they're really just theories. She redefines words. And ultimately, she gets frustrated and simplifies the entire system into 2 categories, good and evil. But this emotional stunting also prevented her from learning to examine herself. One thought I kept having as I read these books was, she's such a hypocrite. I've never encountered a bigger hypocrite. She doesn't do any of what she preaches. Like, listen to this. Being emotionally honest requires a nearly constant review of your thoughts, perceptions, feelings, agendas, motives, attitudes, beliefs, fears, morals, expectations, and justifications numerous times throughout every day. You must learn who you are internally and not rely on your external expressions of what you do and what people think of you to identify your motives. Many of us are duplicitous and hypocritical. We say one thing, yet behave in contradiction to what we said. We mostly make these types of choices from a place of unconsciousness about what we choose to perceive and therefore choose to feel, and our behaviors only follow our chosen perceptions and feelings. She doesn't do any of those things. But if you asked her, she would tell you that she does, and I think she believes it. I listened to her calls from jail. She sounds genuinely confused about why she's been arrested. I'm not suggesting she didn't know what she was doing was wrong, because I think that legally she absolutely did. But I think she believed that morally what she was doing was right and that people would realize that. Where does that belief that she's right come from? I don't know. We all like to think we're right about things. Maybe that natural tendency has run amok in Jodi. She's so entrenched in her certainty that she's right that I'm inclined to think it's pathological, but I can't tell you what that pathology is. Even when she's sitting in jail, she seemed to be trying to devise explanations for her situation that would allow her to preserve this illusion that she's right.
So he said, "Now the brother shall betray the brother, and the father the son, like the father will betray the son. And the children shall rise up against their parents and shall cause them to be put to death. That statement right there is what's going on with me. The children shall rise up and put their parents to death, and ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
I probably cried for an hour straight. Just everything clicked. And I said, I'm happy to go to prison. Because if you continue to read the rest of the chapter, he's like, be grateful. If you're in this situation, be grateful because you're grateful. And you will be saved. And
wow, yeah, that's quite experience to read that from your perspective right now. Wow.
So I have just been begging him, like, you've got to explain this to me. Like, I cannot logically figure out what's going on here. And that's it. That's what's going on.
And the explanation that she landed on was that this is all the work of God. I'm not the first person to suggest that Jodi Hildebrandt believed she was going to become a prophet. She already had her cult. She was tight with Tom Harrison, the cult leader's cult leader. She was writing revelations and battling the forces of Satan and apparently getting possessed by demons. I think that in time, her wakeboarding story would have turned into an NDE story. I've covered a number of people who've done terrible things on this channel now, but Jodi Hildebrandt is the first one I'm scared of. She's the first one whose portrait freaks me out a little. Luckily, her victims all survived, but Jodi's first parole hearing is in December of 2026. What happens if she gets out? Her therapist's license was revoked, but there's nothing to stop her from calling herself a life coach and starting a new community. The fact that so many of the men whose marriages Jodi destroyed say their ex-wives still believe in her is alarming to me. Unlike Chad and Lori and Sarah Boone, Jodi is an ongoing threat. I wouldn't be at all surprised if she's teaching her philosophy in prison right now. And that's really scary. I'd like to end with a quote from Jodi herself. This is from You Are Not Not Enough. The power of choice also means that you are 100% responsible for the outcomes of every perception, thought, motive, behavior, and emotion you choose. In other words, you will become the type of being you choose to become. Jodi had every opportunity to heal, but rather than face her demons, she became one. Please join me next time when we'll be discussing Lori Daybell's father, Barry Cox's self-published book, How the American People Can Dismantle the IRS. And boy, do I have some things to say about this book. We're going to talk about sovereign citizens and American exceptionalism and people who cosplay as lawyers. And I think it'll be a good time. I hope you can tune in. Can you say that on YouTube? Maybe it's, I hope you can tube in. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking or subscribing. Please don't reach out to anyone involved in this case. And remember to use your words wisely. Thanks. You're a Hildebrandt. Go home or go hard. I got that backwards, didn't I? Slated for April. So we've got the lack of practical privacy. Jolie. Oh, crap. All right. I read these out of... God, it was so... Stupid page numbers. It's so hard to actually find pages. The introduction to You Are Not Enough. I didn't pick this book up. That people are genetically predisposed. It presents itself as the very face of selfishness and connection. I mean, selflessness. Crap. How do you do this? Okay. To hold resentment. What happened? But that's the way the interpretation, which was simply connection to what? Wait, I misread that. I took a stance with her that I'd taken before and knew that she would respond. I need water. I can't even hear myself speaking. When she felt penitent. Penitent? That's not right. My God, where's chapter 3 start? She goes off on honesty, responsibility, and humility again. It was curious. Oh my God, listen to me. Okay. This reminds me of a story she told on Tom Harrison's Eternal Am I gonna make it through this? I don't sound good. My throat is dry as a bone. He's in that back bedroom, and he must have reached out of the door after it was... And it's not one of those situations where she reacted before realizing her brother. There's not enough water in the world to wet my throat. Pounding on her other brother. Her other brother? I need vitamin water. The only thing that can fix this is vitamin water. I'm gonna text Kosha. Koshushka, put the vitamin water in the fridge for me.